So if you've been with us in the past several months, you know that we've been tracking through the book of Acts. And today we get to chapter 26. Starting back in chapter 21, Paul, against all of the people who said, Paul, don't go to Jerusalem, it's just going to be trouble. He said, no, I need to go. He felt compelled to go to Jerusalem. And when he got to Jerusalem, he went to the temple courts and he was teaching and he was arrested. And he was endangered. And so he gets moved back in chapters 24, 23. He gets moved over to Caesarea for his own safety. Then in chapters 25 and 26, he's talking with Festus and Agrippa. And today this kind of chapter kind of comes to an end. Chapter 26, he's really on trial and things are kind of crazy. He starts chapter 26 with a statement. We didn't include it in the reading. The whole chapter would have been good to read to really catch the context, but he starts it this way. Paul says, then Agrippa said to Paul, you have my permission to speak. So Paul motioned with his hands and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against the accusations of the Jews, because you, sir, are well acquainted with all the customs and controversies. Therefore, I ask that you would listen to me very patiently. So Agrippa, you may or may not remember, Agrippa is, a little history lesson, Agrippa is the grandson of Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the guy who had John beheaded. He was the governor of that region. He was planted by the Romans. And his grandson is now ruling that region. And when his grandson was about 8, is when Jesus was crucified and rose again. So the guy was around, and he would have heard the stories, and he would have known about this Jesus character, and he knew well the whole customs of the Jews because he was appointed, he was governor there, he'd grown up there. His grandfather was governor there, his father was governor there. He knew the people and their customs. And so Paul, when he comes before him, he says, I'm so glad it's you. You understand all these things. You already know what's going on. So let me just trot out to you what's happening. And then he goes through, as Paul has done on other occasions throughout the book of Acts, he goes through his own story. He goes through this story of how he was a Pharisee born into the kind of real strict religious peoples, and he studied in Jerusalem under Gamaliel, the great teacher, and he got it all. He was really smart. And as a matter of fact, he was super zealous for the causes of the church. And he went out, and you might remember in Acts chapter 7, he was there at the stoning of, anybody remember the guy's name? Stephen? Yeah. He was there at the stoning of Stephen. He was cheering him on. Yeah, get that guy. He's a bad guy. He's causing problems. And then he was on the way to Damascus. Do you remember why? To persecute the church. He was going to go try and arrest people and bring them back to Jerusalem. And on the way to Damascus, light and blindness and a voice from heaven and said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Who are you? I'm Jesus. Whoa. This is quite the trip. This is quite an event. And so Paul is glad that Agrippa is there, because Agrippa is the guy who's going to hear his case, along with this other guy who just came into power. His name's Festus, and so Paul has a chance to talk to these guys. And it's really an interesting thing. Verse 28 that we read just a minute ago has this line, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? You know, it said in verse 1, Paul says he begins his defense, but it's really not a defense at all, is it? He is really not using this as a time to say, I didn't do anything. As a matter of fact, he's using it as a time to try and win every person in the room to become what he is. And what is he? Well, he's a sold-out follower of Jesus Christ. And he says, you know, these guys say to him, you, Paul, and you know, a better translation might be, instead of saying, you've lost your mind, it might be, you're a total nut job. Because they weren't being polite. They were calling him a name. They were saying, you are out of your head. The things that you're saying are crazy talk. And Paul says, no. What I'm saying is a fact, and it's true, and it's reasonable. And you, Agrippa, you've been around for 30-some years. This is 25 years now after Jesus' ascension into heaven. And for 25 years, Agrippa and his family, they've been on the throne, and they've known about this Jesus guy because the movement is growing. And I can just imagine, can't you? Paul is actually kind of almost intoning when he says, these are the facts. What I'm saying is reasonable and true. It's almost like he's saying, you've talked to Eddie, and Eddie was there when Lazarus came out of the tomb, and Eddie was like, woo-wee, 3 days, smelly, man, and I saw it, and it was real. And you've talked to Verna over there, and Verna, yeah, her brother was the one who was one of the lepers who was healed. And you've talked to all these people who know that this is true. This isn't fiction. This is not made up. It's perfectly reasonable, and it's true. And some people are persuaded by the truth, aren't they? Some people are persuaded by facts. As a matter of fact, in the last 300 years or so, we've had this thing called the Enlightenment, right? And it's a kind of an intellectual movement that started about 300 years ago, and it's characterized by things like reason and rationale and empirical data and scientific evidence and all of these things, demonstrable things. Prove it to me, right? So what Paul is saying is these are the facts. You can go interview these people. As a matter of fact, he even said in 1 Corinthians 15, he said, if you don't believe the resurrection, go, there's 500 people who witnessed it. Most of them are still living. Go talk to them. Interview them. Find out if there are such things as mirages or hallucinations, but not group hallucinations of 500 people. This is a fact, Jack. What I'm telling you is reasonable and true. But some people believe that it is only as a matter of rationale that you should persuade someone. Now, my dad, if he's watching on our live feed right now, Dad, that sociology degree that I got in college, it's about to come into play, okay? Most of you thought that's a useless degree, but here is one point at which I can tell you there is value in a sociology degree. There's actually these forces at work that say really why people make belief decisions is not so much about an intellectual assent. It's more about wanting to be part of a sociological group. You know what kind of determines whether people are going to join a group or not? If that group is likable. This is sociological data. People want to join groups where people are likable. It's true. You know what the other reason people join groups is? Because they want to be liked by a group. So think about little Jimmy for a second, and little Jimmy grows up in Bowie, Texas, and his graduating class has 37 people, and they're all conservative Christian kids, and they all go to different churches, but they kind of believe the same thing in Bowie, Texas. And then little, what did I say his name was? Jimmy or Billy? I don't remember. Whatever his name is, he goes off to some liberal big university. And now the cool kids are teaching something very different. Now the cool kids are following the cool professors, and the cool professors say, "You believe that? That's craziness." And little Billy, or Jimmy, or whatever his name is, wants to be liked by this group of people over here. So you know what he does? He changes his belief system for sociological reasons. It happens all the time. Some people are really persuaded by the mind. Some people are really persuaded by sociological influences. Some people are really persuaded by emotion. They say, "I know God's real." How? Because I feel him. Well, wait until 2 years from now and you're not feeling so good. Is God still real? It's all of these factors. We're complicated beings. It's not simply one thing or another, but we are complicated beings. God has wired us for all of these things. And then there's this other thing called biblical truth, which kind of supersedes them all. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And if you want to have a life, you find it in him. And that's exactly what Paul is saying in the text when he says, I want you to become like me. He's saying, I want you to have a life. Not that the king didn't have a life. The king, guess what? The king lived high on the hog. The king had a life. But his life had a pretty quick expiration date compared to the life that Paul was going to have. Because see, in those days, your life expectancy was maybe 50, 60. Today, we'll stretch it out to 80, maybe a little bit more. But if that's your life, that's a pretty short span compared to eternity. And what Paul is saying, he said, I want you guys to know the whole thing, the whole enchilada. I want you to know the truth of eternity. And then he goes into this piece in his speech, and he says, I thought I had it kind of figured out. I was this Pharisee, and I was doing all the right stuff, but I realized, oh my goodness, I couldn't do it on my own. I needed a righteousness that came from outside me. He kind of goes into, in Romans 7, he goes into this little piece where he says, all of the basic commandments, I could kind of keep them until I got down to the coveting thing. Because I could not murder. I could not steal. I could do all those things. But when I got to coveting, I realized I always thought the grass was greener on the other side. When I just had this, when I rose to that level of authority in the Pharisees' hierarchical structure, when I lived so zealously that everybody was saying, look at Paul, he's our champion, and everybody's cheering him on, he was living for the praise of men until Christ humbled him and said, live for the praise of me. And that's kind of what he's saying to you and I today. He's saying, don't live for the things of this world. Now, the things of this world are good. And we are idol-making machines which we turn good things into ultimate things. So the good things of this earth, celebrate them, yes. But don't find your life in the things of this world. Your life is so much more. So my football team, the Aggies, lost again yesterday. So I was over it in about 6 hours. But anyway, no, I actually, you know what I did? I intentionally said, this is a silly football game. I'm going to go out and rake the yard. And I had a great time raking the yard and filling up the dumpster. And Karen and I, we worked in the yard. And, there was much therapy in this. What I'm trying to say is well, the things that we turn, Cowboys are going to win or lose today. Oy vey, big deal. If your life rises or falls with a victory or a defeat in work, in the way a kid behaves, in the way you meet up to your own standards, you're imperfect. You're a broken unit. That's why we keep coming here. That's why we kneel at the altar as a sign that we can't do it on our own. We're bowing to one who is greater than ourselves. We're inviting his very presence into us through his body and his blood. We need to do that all the time. We need to get right-sized before him. Maybe once every 2 weeks with communion, but maybe more frequently than that in our own personal prayer life. The only way the plot line of your life is going to get resolved is in the authority of Jesus over you. It's an interesting thing. Paul tried as hard as he could to honor and obey and fulfill God's ways, and he found himself short until he found himself under the authority of Christ and in that vision. And from that point forward, he realized that everything was possible in God. As a matter of fact, I can even imagine Paul in this moment. Now, the scripture doesn't say this, but I can even imagine in this moment Paul saying, I want you to be everything I am except for these chains. Can't you just imagine him having this image of Stephen, whom he had been there cheering on to death? But it said in Acts chapter 7 that his face, in the face of death, his face was like that of an angel. Isn't that how you want to die? With the face of an angel. Because you're reflecting the glory of the one who you're looking up to. Let us keep our eyes fixed on him, the author and perfecter of our faith. When we keep our eyes fixed on him, we're living with purpose. We're living with boldness. We're not trying to defend ourselves before the almighty judge. Paul didn't try and defend himself here. This is kind of the main point that I wanted to make that I'm not sure I've ever gotten to. Paul did not try and defend himself. Instead, he used this stumping before some of the most powerful people in the world as an opportunity to share the life transformation that had happened in him, that he wanted to pour out to everybody who was a part. That's a pretty cool deal. He invites us to that same kind of powerful living, that same kind of boldness. Lose your life in him, and he will give you everything you need. My friends, would you pray with me? Father, in your goodness, in your kindness, you revealed to Paul a life beyond what he could have imagined. You took a zealot and you turned him into one who would lay down his life, wouldn't even try and defend himself, but would just point to you. We ask that you would do the same in us. Make us servants of the King, the true King, not kings of this world, but kings who reign for eternity. May it be so, and may he live through us. And all of God's people said, amen.